Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the Autobiography. Chapter 1. 10. I thought I'd move in, Joan said. 1976-1978. One weekend in early 1976 I met my future wife, Joan Templeman, at the Manor. I make up my mind about someone within 30 seconds of meeting them, and I fell for Joan almost from the moment I saw her. The problem was that she was already married to someone else, a record producer and keyboard player, who was producing a virgin band called Wigwam. Joan was a down-to-earth Scots lady, and I immediately saw that she did not suffer fools gladly. I knew that I couldn't attract her attention in the same way as I had attracted Kristen. Most of my past relationships with women had been based on great public showmanship, but for the first time I felt that here was a woman who didn't want me to get up to my usual antics. Joan worked in an antiques shop called Dodo on Westbourne Grove, close to our offices at Vernon Yard. On Monday morning, I hovered uncertainly outside the shop, then screwed up my courage and walked in. The shop sold old signs and advertisements. When I asked the lady who owned the shop whether Joan was there, she looked at me suspiciously. "Are you a customer?" she asked, glowering. "Yes, I'm fascinated by old signs," I said, looking uncertainly around the shop. Joan came through from the back. "I see you've met Liz," she said. "Liz, this is Richard. So what would you like to buy?" Liz pressed me. There was no way out. Over the next few weeks, my visits to Joan amassed me an impressive collection of old hand-painted tin signs, which advertised anything from Hovis bread to Woodbine cigarettes. One tin sign read "Dive in here for TA." I also bought a large pig which played the cymbals, and had once stood in a butcher's shop. One of my favorite signs was an old picture advertising Danish bacon and eggs, which showed a pig leaning casually against a wall listening to a chicken singing. The chicken was celebrating her freshly laid egg, and the caption to the scene was, "Now, that's what I call music." I gave this to Simon Draper, since he was always terribly grumpy in the mornings until he had eaten a decent breakfast. He hung it over his desk, where it later inspired the title for our annual Greatest Hits compilations, "Now That's What I Call Music." By the time I had bought all my Christmas presents from Dodo, Liz told Joan that she was the best shop assistant she had ever had. Joan had been married to her husband, Ronnie Leahy, for almost 8 years, but they had no children. Ronnie traveled a good deal, and it seemed to me, perhaps conveniently, that he and Joan had begun to drift apart. Whenever Ronnie was away, I called up Joan's friends and asked whether they were seeing Joan. "Mind if I tag along?" I asked casually. They soon called me tag along, which I really didn't mind as long as by tagging along I had the chance to sit somewhere near Joan and talk with her. Our courtship was unlike the other romances I'd had, which I'd been able to control. Joan is an intensely private person, and it was extremely difficult to find out the state of her marriage. While I knew what I felt about her, I had very little idea what Joan made of me. I thought that she might be intrigued by my persistence, but beyond that I was in the dark. Eventually, Joan agreed to come with me to the Isle of Wight, and we spent the weekend in a tiny hotel in Bembridge. It was the start of our affair. Since Joan was married, we both carried on living double lives. She could not see me during the week, when Ronnie was at home, but early one morning she decided to surprise me by dropping round to my house in Denby Terrace, where I was still living. As she let herself in, she saw my cleaning lady Martha going up the stairs to my bedroom, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea on it. Joan knew that I was in bed with another woman, which I was, So she stopped Martha and put a flower on the tray. "Just say to Richard that Joan says hello," she said, and then turned on her heel and went back to the shop. I was mortified. I dashed round to see her at Dodo and persuaded her to have lunch with me. "So what's all this about undying love?" Joan asked sarcastically. "Well, I was lonely," I said lamely. "I couldn't wait until the weekend." "That's a pathetic excuse," Joan said. I tried to look ashamed of myself and contrite, but we caught each other's eye and then both burst out laughing. Our affair continued for almost a year. We were desperate to be with each other and would call each other up whenever we had 5 minutes to spare. Joan would slip away from Dodo, and I would leave Vernon Yard, and we would meet at Denby Terrace, which was right between us. The geography of our affair was very tight-knit. Vernon Yard, Westbourne Grove and Denby Terrace all cross Portobello Road within 20 yards of each other, and so Joan and I lived out our affair within a tiny intense triangle. When we stole 20 precious minutes at lunch, quarter of an hour before a meeting, or a few moments after Dodo shut up shop, we tried to shut the outside world away. But along with the passion, we were also intensely aware that Joan was married, and that we were in danger of causing pain to Ronnie. In some ways Joan and Ronnie had a similar relationship to Kristen's and mine. Ronnie had wanted to experiment with sleeping with other women, and had told Joan that she needed to broaden her horizons too. Joan had been at a loss because she wasn't able to cope with a series of one-night stands, and so she gradually began to fall in love with me. Our affair was further complicated when Kristen heard that I was in love with Joan and arrived back in London. By this time I had managed to buy Duende back from Kevin Ayres. At more or less the same time, Kristen had left him. She now told me that she wanted to get back together with me. We were after all still married. My family has always maintained that you stick with your marriage through thick and thin, and so I felt a great responsibility to agree to Kristen. But I was in love with Joan. It was a nightmarish situation for each of us. Joan felt torn between me and Ronnie. Kristen had been torn between me and Kevin, and I now felt torn between Kristen and Joan. What had started off as a dream affair with Joan in the tiny bedroom in the house at Denby Terrace was now beginning to destroy 5 people's lives. The tangle of these 4 relationships finally resolved itself when I was at a party with both Joan and Kristen. Joan's best friend Linda cornered me. "So who are you actually in love with?" she demanded. "This can't go on. You're all killing yourselves and you need to sort it out." At the last minute, Simon was unable to come with me, and I went with Ken. And so, at the start of 1978, a punk rocker, an accountant and a reformed Earl's Court hippie flew together to Kingston, Jamaica, to sign up some reggae bands and look for toasters. Knowing that Jamaicans didn't trust written contracts, we flew in with a briefcase containing $30,000 in cash and set up shop in the Kingston Sheraton. Word soon went around that 3 gringos were in town looking to audition musicians, and a stream of bands started coming round to the hotel room. Ken sat on the bed with his briefcase. Johnny and I listened to the band's tapes and chatted to them. Johnny decided which artists we should sign, and then Ken would open up the briefcase and take out the money. American dollars were hard currency in Jamaica, where imports were banned and everything was bought on the black market. Some of the bands were so keen to impress us that they brought their drums and guitars with them. Our room was soon full of tall Rastafarians wearing massive bobble hats in red, yellow and green stripes. One tall singer towered over us and sang lovingly about his spiritual homeland of Ethiopia. I watched Johnny as he sat on the sofa and nodded his head gently to the music. It was difficult to believe that this was the same man, gaunt and thin as a lightning conductor, who had screeched abuse at everyone, spat at pictures of the Queen, and galvanized a generation of anger. Thinking about the Emperor Haile Selassie, who inspired the Rastafarians, I wondered whether the British royal family hadn't missed a trick. Over the course of a week we signed almost 20 reggae bands, and found a couple more toasters, called Prince Far I and Tupazuki, into the bargain. I tried to persuade Johnny Lydon to stay with the Sex Pistols, but to no avail. He told me that the group had fallen out among themselves, and with Malcolm McLaren, that Sid Vicious was in a tailspin, taking all kinds of drugs and growing violent with Nancy, his girlfriend. Johnny wanted to go solo, and he had a couple of musicians in mind to form a new band called Pill Public Image Limited. I was sorry, since I wanted to build the Sex Pistols as the next classic rock band to follow the Rolling Stones. After all, the Rolling Stones had started off as the most shocking band in the world, with Mick Jagger being arrested for possessing drugs and scandalizing public opinion. By 1978, the Stones had been going for more than 15 years, and they had become part of the rock and roll establishment. And they didn't look like stopping. Coping with success obviously brings its own difficulties for a rock band, but getting your name into people's minds is almost the hardest thing to achieve. The Sex Pistols had certainly entered the world's vocabulary, if only as a byword for all that most people found revolting, and I felt that they were crazy to throw away that advantage. I tried to persuade Johnny that the Sex Pistols could use their name in slightly different ways, and perhaps move away from the extreme punk image they had made their own. I also wanted to push them overseas. Never mind, the Bollocks had sold only 300,000 records overseas, about the same number as it had sold in Britain, and I felt sure that they could do much better with successive albums. After Mike Oldfield's instant success, and then his withdrawal from public life, I was determined that the Sex Pistols would not collapse as well. They were Virgin's top band, and they had been the catalyst both for Virgin Music's wider success and a whole new wave of rock music. But Johnny was in no mood to listen. On our final evening, we found a Rasta bar up along the coast from Kingston, which sold fish and strong jerk sauce. We sat outside watching the sea. A flock of pelicans were dive-bombing in formation, and we watched them methodically work their way through shoals of fish, each one peeling off and diving down, tucking in their wings before plunging into the water. We drank Red Stripe beer and listened to Bob Marley. Although I kept turning the conversation back to what the Sex Pistols could do, Johnny was not really listening. There was a world of difference between Mike Oldfield and the Sex Pistols. But both of them had found that they could not cope with the pressures of fame. From my point of view, as the head of their record company, there was a further difference. Mike Oldfield had made Virgin Music a tremendous amount of money that we had spent building up the company and signing new acts. We would not be in business without him. Although the Sex Pistols had been number one with God Save the Queen, and their album, Never Mind the Bollocks, had also been number one, Virgin had not made very much money from the group. As I sat there with Johnny Rotten on the Jamaican beach, I was forced to accept that Virgin would never make much more money from the Sex Pistols. Malcolm McLaren had arranged for the Sex Pistols to be in a film called The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, and I wondered whether there might be a soundtrack which we could release from that, but otherwise Simon, Ken and I were going to have to accept that from now on the Sex Pistols were not a going concern. Although it was highly frustrating to see them falling apart, and in a far worse way than Mike Oldfield, who continued to produce records which sold well, there was some consolation in that, After we had signed the Sex Pistols, Virgin had become the smart record label for punk and new wave bands to sign with. The music world had seen the promotion which we had put behind the Sex Pistols, and a whole new generation of exciting bands was approaching us. Simon had picked up bands such as the Motors, XTC, the Skids, Magazine, Penetration, and the Members, which were all selling well, and another band called the Human League were building up a following. Virgin Music Publishing had signed a schoolteacher from Newcastle called Gordon Sumner, who used the stage name Sting, and sang with a band called Last Exit, who were thought to have some promise. I returned to the Kingston Sheraton, mulling over Virgin's prospects without the Sex Pistols. There was a message from Joan, asking me to call her. "Shall we meet in New York?" she asked. I left Jamaica the next morning.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.